What is the best witty comeback you've ever witnessed? Had a really witty teacher for my game design class. The vice principal hated him for whatever reason. One day we were all studiously working with our headphones on programming away, while our teacher was up front reading a book, very available and approachable if we had any questions. Then the VP walks in the room. VP, Mr. Teacher, it has come to my attention that you have absolutely no control over this class. This is unacceptable. Teacher gives him a fairly nonchalant stare, coolly and calmly places his book down, and claps his hands loudly 3 times, which was his very effective way of getting our attention while listening to music. Mind you, the following occurred without us knowing why the VP was there or what he had said. Teacher, okay class, listen up, I have an exercise for you. This'll only take a few moments. First and foremost, everybody stand up. We all stood up in near unison very quickly. Teacher, but now I want all of you to leave the room and stand outside in the hallway, and no matter what this guy says, as he points his finger at VP, do not come back in the room until I say so. Okay, go. We all exit the room, a little intrigued by what was going on. Teacher, okay VP, bring them back in the classroom. We didn't budge to this day. That is one of my favorite stories to tell. My Phil was staying with us because his house burned down and the rest of my husband's family ghosted. It was a tense 5 months, especially for my kids. We're raising our kids to have minds of their own, and while they should try to always be courteous, they don't have to show respect to anyone that doesn't respect them. My Phil doesn't appreciate this school of parenting and comes from the era of children are seen and not heard. Well, one day he was talking to my youngest, who had just turned 6, and she enjoys conversation, asking questions and contributing to the dialogue. My Phil thinks kids should just sit there quietly while he talks at them. So, he told her a little information and she responded, "Oh, I didn't know that." My Phil snapped at her with a lot of irritation. "Yeah, well, there are a lot of things you don't faking know." Which was his way of telling her to STFU. Point I was about to jump in, but in a heartbeat she fired back, "Yeah, well, I know your house burned down. I had to leave." Before I laughed in his face. And it may have been rude, but she had been enduring months of him talking down to her and treating her as if she was stupid because she's a child. He had it coming. Oh, I hope I'm not too late. This is the only time I've ever thought of a witty comeback on the fly, and I am so proud of it. Point a few years back, my son was in kindergarten, so every day I would take my daughter, then 3, to the bus stop to drop him off and pick him up. Another dad would also be there to get his son. Every day he smoked and drank beer. This is relevant in a bit. While he waited, every so often he would pry into my personal life and make weird innuendos. For example, I was aimlessly kicking leaves as I waited and he said, "You know, kicking leaves means you're sexually frustrated." Which made no sense at the time, but I didn't say anything. Point is, I didn't much care for him. Point anyway, one day my daughter and I were waiting to pick up my son, and she was nearby playing with a doll she brought. At the time, she had a habit of sucking on her fingers. I didn't really care as I figured she would grow out of it, which she did. The dad walks up and starts in on, "You gotta stop that habit. Mom, you know sucking on her fingers is bad for her." And I was just done with him, so I said, "What? You mean like smoking, y'all?" It was great. You could have heard a pin drop. Finally, he says in the quietest I've ever heard him speak, "I'm sorry ma'am, if I offended you." It was one of my greatest moments. Seems like the thread to tell this story in from long ago. Point me equals 16-year-old HS student in Spanish class. Victim equals incredibly terrible HS Spanish teacher scene. Teacher was giving us a vocabulary quiz. Simple, here's a word in Spanish, what is it in English? She gave us one word and was called out to the hall by the principal. While she was out, maybe 2 minutes tops, some in the class talked to each other while I put my head down and rested, was exhausted for some reason. On coming back into the room, the teacher told us to turn in our papers. Since we'd only had one word, we were confused and asked why. She told us we were all getting a 0 since we talked during a test. This was crazy, as one word hardly seems like enough to merit giving the whole class a 0. After some grumbling, she repeats, "Everyone who was talking, turn in your papers." She circled the class, picking up papers from people, until she got to my desk. "Turn in your paper, Griffey." "I wasn't talking," I said. I had my head on the desk. Well, this just pissed her off. She railed at the class, going on and on about how we were all a bunch of cheats. She didn't know how we thought we'd make it in the world, as you can't just cheat your way through. And then, "I don't know how you are all going to graduate. I don't know how you are passing your other classes." Me. Raises hand her. "What, Griffey?" Me. "In our other classes, ma'am, we have teachers." Beat her. Starts crying. Runs out of room for remainder of class. This one wasn't necessarily witty, but very satisfying. I was a freshman in high school, and I was generally a pretty good student, but my science class was just terrible to this teacher, and I'm not proud of it, but I definitely joined in. Anyway, one day she's explaining how important it is we all study for our upcoming midterm exam, and me just being a snotty little sheet says, "Well, what if I don't want to study?" And this girl, let's call her Sue, probably the only well-behaved kid in the class, whips around and snaps at me, "If you don't study, you'll fail." I just looked her dead in the eyes, and real calm I said, "I'm not going to study, and not only am I not going to fail, I'm going to get a better grade than you." So, over the next few days I deliberately don't study at all of this exam. I don't even crack the textbook. Midterm day comes, I take the test, and it seems fine. I certainly didn't fail. I'm not sure I did better than Sue though. She generally got very good grades the next week. The teacher is passing back the exams, and when she gets to me, she leans in and says, "Congratulations Delventhal. You got the best grade in the class. Hey Sue. How'd you do? How'd you do, Sue? Hey Sue." She ignored me. So, this was middle school, but I'm still a little proud of this one point to preface. In my 8th grade English class there was this kid, E, who was the type of kid that loved to treat everyone like his inferior. He made bad jokes, tried to put people down, and always acted like hot shit despite the fact he wasn't. Generally this kid was brushed off, but I had a particular dislike for him, and outside of his posse of friends, my class shared some level of slight distaste for him. Meanwhile, I was a slightly overweight quiet band kid who liked to play video games and learn programming outside of school. I didn't have too many friends. I made a few good ones, but was overall a little socially awkward and under the radar of most points. So one day near the end of the year the teacher's computer isn't working, and knowing that I'm into computers she calls me over. First step in troubleshooting, I try to reproduce the problem and turn it off and on again, and hear a couple beeps when the computer is posting. Thinking it through, it seemed like something might be loose internally, but I doubted that, because the computer probably hadn't been moved since it was installed, so I decided, I guess I'll check the back and check if any of the cords being loose might be the problem. E, sitting somewhat close to the teacher's desk, is not impressed by my measures and scoffs. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Loud enough for the whole class to hear. At this I got angry that he was trying to humiliate me in front of my peers as I'm trying everything I know to understand what's wrong. Without missing a beat I casually turn around and say, "I built my own computer, so I think I'm more qualified than your snarky as not the most witty I know, but this is middle school so cut me a break." At this the class erupts, not expecting me to so quickly go on the offensive, and I see E's face go a glorious shade of crimson as I just got the class on my side. During this, the teacher is turning on her computer, and a few moments after I deliver my remark she says, "It's working now. Thank you Nabraza ref. You can go back to your seat." For the rest of the year he had it out for me, but I didn't care, because I saw his insecurity in every encounter with him since. One time a mentally handicapped kid dissed the biggest bully at our school. There's this guy whose last name is Dixon who thought he was in charge of my engineering design class, but in reality was just a massive dickhead. Anyway, it was nearing the end of class, and for most of the class it was work time, because we'd just finished a test, but some people were still working on it, including Dixon. This mentally handicapped kid, who we'll call Alex, was picked on a lot at school. He was socially inept, tried to be funny, but just didn't have the timing. He regularly got in trouble for using vulgarity in his attempts at comedy because he wanted to fit in and saw other kids doing it. He smelled. He was overweight. He was really dealt a bad hand. Point anyway, we were basically sitting around waiting for class to end, except for Dixon and a couple other slower kids. Alex had taken this opportunity to take a nap and began rather loudly snoring. Most of the class, including myself, though it was pretty funny. But Dixon was not having it and shouted, "Hey, wake up fatus, you're snoring again," and before the teacher could tell off Dixon for using the word as in a Midwestern public school, Alex groggily wakes up and says, "Don't be such a dick, son." The class erupted into laughter. It was the funniest thing he'd said in his life. He wanted so badly to be funny, and in that moment, he was. I know every Tumblr story says that people started clapping, but like 5 or 6 of us actually did. There were only like 13 people at full attendance for like 3 seconds before the teacher reminded us that there are still people taking a test. Point, he was glowing the whole week. Still stunk like a motherfucker though, not gonna lie. Freshman year university, my roommate and I end up in the same gen ed class. My roommate is somewhat of a cocky fellow, always been very good at school, top of his class. Something business ethics, or whatever was the title. One day we had a guest speaker come in, and opens very simply with a scenario. Something about imagine yourself as a salesman, receive cases of wine at your residence, baseball jersey, the whole 9 yards of special treatment from a company. The speaker asked the class, "What do you think happens next?" And my roommate shoots his hand in the air and says, "Not really sure, I kinda feel some kind of ethical dilemma coming up soon." The speaker sits there with the most dumbfounded look upon his face, almost as if he had seen the face of God himself, and said, "Oh my goodness, did you saw all of that?" My roommate, feeling very smug as this is said, "Wow, I have to say, I'm impressed." All with a very sincere tone, until I must ask, were you valedictorian at your high school? Because, damn, and I swear to God the classroom some 30 feet down the hall complained from the ceremonious uproar. Little bit of justice, I still never let him life down. Point, best part, he lost valedictorian to his rival nerd in high school, and was still a little sore about it. This was my best comeback, although not amazing background. I was a bad student who never did his homework. Point, I go to English class one day in high school. I go to class early, which was rare, because I knew the night before I was not assigned homework, so I was safe to go to class early. As other students are entering, my whole teacher gets off of his computer and sits at the table in front of the entire class, including the girl who asked me to Winter's Ball, and some other girls I had crushes on. He asks me how the homework assignment went. I said, I didn't do any, because I didn't know there was any. To which he responded, "Wow. Why am I not the least bit surprised? That's why I asked you, because I knew you didn't do it." There was an insanely awkward silence for about a minute, and I wanted to fight this guy. I was so furious. Finally another, straighter, student broke the ice. Mr. G, you didn't assign homework last night." I just simply stood up and walked for the door, and before heading to the dean's office to try and get this teacher in trouble, I just said, "You know everyone thinks you're an asshole, why am I not surprised?" I went to the dean's office, and no punishment was given to the prick. Like I said, I was a bad student who never did his homework, so I still got in a little bit of trouble. He gave me a B for my final grade, and the girl who asked me to the ball thought I was super cool. Didn't get to see either, but I know the stories. My mom and her siblings went to a church school for elementary through high school, and apparently back then, around the 70s/80s, nuns still taught there. The sibling we are focusing on in this tale is the youngest, my Uncle Dave. Apparently, he was in a particularly boring class and he wasn't paying attention, and the nan at the front of the room, who was currently teaching, and apparently not teaching very well, said to him, "Mr. David, are you ready to pay attention correctly?" He replied, "Only if you're ready to teach correctly, sister." She was, of course, angry with his response. "Would you like to show the class how I'm supposed to be teaching?" she said to him. "Sure," he replied. And he proceeded to go up to the front of the room and show her how she was supposed to be teaching. Point, another story involves two of my dad's aunts. Let's call them Shirley and Marge. They were sisters and always ratting on each other for something. One night, Shirley's about to go out, and she's wearing these red high heels. Marge notices them and says, "Good God, Shirley, where did you get those heels? You look like a prostitute." Shirley replied, "I got them from your closet." And now my favorite personal burn point: Halloween 6th grade. We could wear our costumes to school. I had thrown together a last-minute movie star costume, which consisted of one of my nicer dresses and a pair of sunglasses. A guy, dressed as a mobster, approached me and asked, "What are you supposed to be, a diva?" Without missing a beat, I replied, "What are you supposed to be, a princess?" These are some of my best stories, at a time when our president and other politicians tend to apologize for our country's prior actions. Here's a refresher on how some of our former patriots handled negative comments about our country. JFK's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, was in France in the early 60s when de Gaulle decided to pull out of NATO. De Gaulle said he wanted all US military out of France as soon as possible. Rusk responded, "Does that include those who are buried here?" De Gaulle did not respond. When in England, at a fairly large conference, Colin Powell was asked by the Archbishop of Canterbury if our plans for Iraq were just an example of empire building by George Bush. He answered by saying, "Over the years, the United States has sent many of its fine young men and women into great peril to fight for freedom beyond our borders. The only amount of land we have ever asked for in return is enough to bury those that did not return." There was a conference in France where a number of international engineers were taking part, including French and American. During a break, one of the French engineers came back into the room saying, "Have you heard the latest dumb stunt Bush has done? He has sent an aircraft carrier to Indonesia to help the tsunami victims. What does he intended to do? Bomb them?" A Boeing engineer stood up and replied quietly, "Our carriers have 3 hospitals on board that can treat several hundred people. They are nuclear powered and can supply emergency electrical power to shore facilities. They have 3 cafeterias with the capacity to feed 3,000 people 3 meals a day. They can produce several thousand gallons of fresh water from seawater each day, and they carry half a dozen helicopters for use in transporting victims and injured to and from their flight deck. We have 11 such ships. How many does France have?" A US Navy admiral was attending a naval conference that included admirals from the US, English, Canadian, Australian and French navies. At a cocktail reception, he found himself standing with a large group of officers that included personnel from most of those countries. Everyone was chatting away in English as they sipped their drinks, but a French admiral suddenly complained that, whereas Europeans learn many languages, Americans learn only English. He then asked, "Why is it that we always have to speak English in these conferences, rather than speaking French?" Without hesitating, the American admiral replied, "Maybe it's because the Brits, Canadians, Aussies, and Americans arranged it, so you wouldn't have to speak German." Robert Whiting, an elderly gentleman of 83, arrived in Paris by plane. At French customs, he took a few minutes to locate his passport in his carry-on. "You have been to France before, monsieur?" the customs officer asked sarcastically. Mr. Whiting admitted that he had been to France previously. "Then you should know enough to have your passport ready," the American said. "The last time I was here, I didn't have to show it." Impossible. Americans always have to show your passports on arrival in France. The American senior gave the Frenchman a long hard look. Then he quietly explained, "Well, when I came ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day in 1944 to help liberate this country, I couldn't find a single Frenchman to show a passport to." Grade 9 science class. I'd been in trouble earlier that day. We'd been on a field trip, and the bus driver misheard a conversation and thought I was insulting him. I was talking about something else entirely, and didn't even notice him. He pulled me back on the bus, started shouting and screaming, and said he wouldn't drive us back until I apologized for insulting him. I refused to do it, saying I hadn't been talking about him in the first place, and I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't do. Eventually, he drives us back to school, goes in to rant to the vice principal in charge of discipline, and then I get called in. VP goes nuts on me, tells me I should have apologized, and tells me to get out. As I'm leaving, he leans out his door and shouts, When I say out, I mean get off the school grounds. I say okay, and leave. I start to walk home, and then realized I'd left the school grounds, so I turned around and went back to class. 2 classes later, the door bursts open, and all 6 feet 4 inches of the VP is livid with anger as he points his finger at me and screams, "I thought I told you to leave the school grounds." I was all of 13 years old, and I calmly replied, "You didn't say I couldn't come back." Class erupted, even the teacher, and VP goes nuts, drags me bodily from my chair in the room, and sends me home, this time with explicit instructions not to come back. Had kids coming up to me for 2 days afterwards, laughing their heads off,